You don't have enough aircraft. You don't have enough ships.
Ratcheting up the rhetoric.
So we're already at war with China.
You ask the Chinese, they'd tell you.
Is it just Beijing bluff?
You're going to lose. Our soldiers would be brave, and our weapons would be lethal.
Or real this time?
Australia is very much on the menu.
Our Chief of Navy has his say.
There are 1,000 ways to start a conflict. There's only 2 ways that it ends.
Hello and welcome to Extra Minutes, the 60 Minutes podcast. I'm Amelia Adams and I'm joined today by 60 Minutes producer Serge Negus. Serge, welcome.
G'day, mate.
Well, we have had a really interesting few weeks putting
have.
together a story on China's influence in the Pacific, and there's a lot to unpack in that. Obviously, China is becoming a lot more prevalent in Australian waters. We saw that a couple of months ago when they sent some warships a little bit close
Very
and a
close.
little bit unannounced for
Yeah.
everyone's liking. And the Navy, the Australian Navy, the Australian military more broadly, but the Navy especially, I think it's fair to say, are stepping up since then. And a couple of months ago, they invited us on one of their warships, which was a cool experience.
It was, especially because, we haven't had much access to the Australian Navy over the years. And when I saw that they were doing a submarine hunting exercise off the coast of Western Australia, I thought I may as well just hit them up and see if we can come, and did not expect to get a response back. And they got back to us and said, can you come out tomorrow, basically. And so we had to jump on a flight and fly to Perth and then drive to Bunbury.
Yep.
And got up at, crack of dawn and jumped on these skiffs and went out to the ship and got hauled into the boat. It was a very cool experience for me because I've never actually done that on a Navy ship. And I mean, you've had more experience with these things.
Well, but to your point, I've had some really good access with the US Navy, but the Australian Navy has been more difficult to get on board and to see what they're up to. And part of that you can understand, but I think the fact that they did invite you goes to show that they really want to show us.
I think so, yeah. It feels like that. It felt like they really wanted to, I guess, show what their capability is at the moment, and I guess show face in the context of China and the ships that had just come around the country. So it definitely feels like they're trying to show the country and the nation and also other countries around the world what they can do.
Yep. We had access in this story as well to the Chief of the Royal Australian Navy who hasn't spoken before actually publicly about that particular incident with the Chinese warships. He doesn't do a great deal of media more broadly. And so again, the Navy putting up Vice Admiral Hammond, who's an extremely, I think, impressive military chief. And he's certainly a realist about what's going on.
Totally. And I actually had a chat this morning to one of the media guys at the Navy and told him how Mark made me feel a lot more comfortable about the position that we're in. He's definitely a great head for them, and I feel like he should probably get out a bit more because he really will make, I think, the audience feel a bit more comfortable about the position that Australia is in. He was fantastic.
He was, and he gave a really interesting and quite a different explanation to the military response and what we knew, what was reported at the time those Chinese warships came. So I think it's well worth for anyone to have a watch and see how he explained it.
Exactly, because I guess there was this hysteria at the time that the Navy or no authorities knew that the Chinese ships were there, but I think that was lost really in what actually happened. What it sounds like, according to Mark, that they were shadowing the Chinese vessels from the moment they entered our waters, and then they stopped shadowing them once they went into international waters. Then they did the live firing, but then the way it kind of got covered, it felt like none of our forces knew, but turns out they actually did.
Well, we were on HMAS Brisbane with the Chief, and as you mentioned, HMAS Hobart over in WA before that. So we were very lucky to have access to both of those warships. But more broadly, beyond Australian waters, we've been looking at China's influence in the Pacific, which is nothing new.
No.
And Beijing is certainly getting its tentacles into different island nations and really, trying to become dominant in our region, which is no secret. And so you began researching one of those very small island nations.
Yeah, I did. And it actually had nothing to do necessarily with, navies or militaries or anything at first, or even like soft diplomacy or anything like that we ended up going into. But basically I had a friend who was a wildlife photographer, or is a wildlife photographer, and they would go to Tonga every year annually for the whale migration over there to take photos with the whales as they were calving. It's known as one of the best places in the world to do that. But they went back recently and everything had changed because all of a sudden some Chinese tourist operators had been taking over the whale boat industry, I guess you could say, and the tourists were interacting with the whales in a way that would scare them away. They were jumping all on top of them, and this friend of mine, this photographer, said, look, you should do something about this. So I started looking into that. No one wants to talk because everyone's a bit sort of frightened about like stepping on anyone's toes because the Chinese tourists are very important for money in Tonga. But then I found out that Tonga had these huge debts to China, and that they had heaps of industry in Tonga, and I started looking into it and I was like, wow, this is not small. They have this 190 million Australian dollar loan to China, and I mean that's just too much for a small country like that.
Yeah, so we should explain that comes, most of that, from 2006. There were those pro-democracy riots, and most of the capital of Tonga was destroyed.
Yeah.
And it was China, as you say, that stepped in, lent the money, which Tonga now is really struggling to pay back. It is, in a way, it's such a small developing country, very poor.
Very.
So it is, in a way, the perfect victim, if that's not too strong a term, of debt trap diplomacy.
It really is. And I mean, when we went there, you get on the ground and China's presence is really everywhere. All the construction sites, all of the local corner stores.
Yep.
I mean, and that goes back even further, like because there was a period in the 90s when the Tongans gave free passports basically to Chinese migrants. But basically that set up a position, I guess, for the country that meant that once they got into trouble, like they did with the pro-democracy riots, it was very easy for China to then come in and then start pushing things a bit further.
It was a really interesting snapshot of what's happening across the Pacific, and we knew that 60 Minutes had been to the Solomons in different places, but I had never been to Tonga.
Neither.
And I remember the drive from the airport, you and I were quite struck by. I mean, it's a gorgeous developing island, so think palm trees, and it's quite beautiful in parts, quite run down in parts, but then we would see like a brand new bright red Chinese owned and named shop, and it's it does stick out.
It really does. And I guess if you can try and imagine it, when you go traveling overseas anywhere, usually when you go to those countries, the first thing you notice is what is traditional of that country,
Yes.
that nation, right?
Yeah.
But you get to Tonga and it seems like it could almost be Chinese. Like that's how prevalent those shops are. And so it's quite confusing in a way.
Yeah, and as well as the capital being rebuilt, which you mentioned, the loan, there's also the sports complex, huge, fantastic new, it's 55 million Australian dollars sporting complex that China's built them. That was a gift.
Yeah.
St George Palace we visited, which is where all their government buildings are, the PMO, the Prime Minister's office and Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the moment, so an important building, a gift.
It's like imagine if like China had built Parliament House
Yeah.
in Canberra. That's
Thank you very
what it
much.
is. Yeah.
What else did we see? Construction. Chinese contract workers rebuilding actually the royal family's tombs, which are obviously very
Huge job.
important. Tonga's the last monarchy in the Pacific. And then all the shops and businesses. So as we were told by locals, China really is in every kind of aspect of day-to-day life.
They are. And what was interesting for us, I guess, when we went there was that they're very aware of how much they need to have the help from China. And they're walking this fine line and this balancing act between the West and China when it comes to what support they get, because, like you said, they are a developing nation. And so it's very interesting to see how that reality's played out, but also understand why they need to walk both paths.
Yeah, and we have some really interesting talent, I think. I mean, the former ambassador to Beijing who said, you dropped the ball. The West dropped the ball. China picked up the ball. I mean, they're very blunt about what happened, really, I guess, post-World War II, when China has sort of moved in, for a lack of a better term, and it has been successful.
It really, really has been. And I mean, it shows as well, though, when we were there, we saw some projects that the Australian government was running as well. And so it seems like the Australian government is now trying to, do more, which is a good thing. And I mean, for Tongans, though, they are clearly in need of all of the help they can get, and they can't necessarily make a choice one side or the other. And that's a difficult diplomatic scenario for Australia.
It is. And just for context in that, Tonga's a fairly new democracy, 2010, I think they became a democracy. and so they're sort of juggling that. And we visited their parliament, which is a gorgeous old, very traditional, sort of reminded me of the New Zealand Parliament actually, building, and at least the first 20 minutes or half hour were prayer
Half an
and
hour at
singing.
least. Yeah, it was
beautiful
beautiful.
Tongan voices. Yeah, it was lovely. That was a real experience actually. But they are a new democracy, so they're juggling all of this input from, communist China.
Yeah.
And as you say, I left there with a sense of, well, I can understand why a lot of them are on the fence.
Exactly. And I mean, to go back to the parliament, the thing that's amazing about that scenario is they were in a temporary parliament after they had a cyclone that destroyed the previous one. And they all the politicians turned up in Chinese cars, but then the new parliament that's being built is being funded by Australia.
Yes.
And so it's a really stark example of just how much they need from both sides.
That's right. We visited that too. It is just a patch of
moment.
grass at the moment.
Yeah.
But to that point, I think they're obviously very keen to, there is a love there for Australia.
Yes.
And they're very keen to work with Australia. We went and saw actually one of our sort of soft diplomacy programs that's underway quite successfully.
Yeah, so there's an NRL DFAT program there that's it seems to make perfect sense, doesn't it? Like, we have so many Tongan footballers here in the country, so many Tongan immigrants here in the country.
Export, surely.
Yeah, it would be massive. And so that seems like a really smart way for Australia to be, going about diplomacy in the country, and they loved that and they spoke so highly of that.
Yeah, and it's about, I guess, beyond the vast resources and, building a wharf or a government building or whatever it is, as they told us, it is about winning hearts and minds.
Yep.
And I was really interested to hear some of the Tongan leadership say that, the Chinese are they're really thorough. They get to Tonga and they learn the language. They integrate in society. They send their kids to Tongan schools. There's a lot of Mandarin spoken now. They play a long game.
And I think that for me was a really stark reminder of how I guess Australia historically has gone about things in the Pacific, in that, that we heard people saying, the Chinese come here, they learn the language, which is the utmost respect you can give a nation if you come there as a migrant, and, they integrate into society and they hang out with us. They're friends with us. Whereas they said that the Australian diplomats there are not necessarily quite like that, and they tend to hang in their own circles and they don't learn the language, which is, it seems like a small thing, but I mean, it is maybe a failure on that level when it comes to our diplomatic efforts there.
It's certainly a very different approach.
Very different.
Yeah, I do get the sense that Australia has taken note.
Yes.
And, what's happening in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, I think has got everyone on alert. Our government has increased budget support to Tonga. The NRL program you just mentioned, it feels like Australia is stepping back up in
definitely.
Tonga. Because I think if you look at the list, as we've done several times in researching this story, of the different agreements that Pacific and South Pacific island nations are making or have with Australia and with Beijing, there's a lot now
definitely.
with China, and there's a lot in discussion and underway, and some of them are quite alarming.
Yeah, totally. They're all across the Pacific, and I mean, you can only hope that the way in which Australia goes about things in the next few years balances that out to some degree.
Of course, China's view on this is very different.
Yes.
And we have tried to, I think, as we always attempt to do, give all sides of the story in this case, because there are a lot of different viewpoints. And you were able to get in contact with and secure an interview with a former colonel of the People's Liberation Army, who was fascinating.
He was. Jobo, he has an incredible history in both academia and also in the army over there.
Senior PLA military figure.
He knows how things operate and what China is trying to do. And it was very interesting. He was sort of saying that these gifts that, to other people might seem to be trying to gain influence in these sorts of countries was actually just good business, and that there was no attempt to try and create a sphere of influence, as he said, because herding the cats is too difficult. It's just such a different mentality to the way the West looks at things. We're all about alliances, and we are about trying to create like a system where we have lots of allies and friends where we do have influence and can get them to do certain things for us. But he claims China doesn't want any of that. They just want to do good business.
The thing that surprised me, one of the things that surprised me about my conversation with Jobo was I put to him that, for Chinese warships to turn up in Australian waters unannounced and then start live firing was pretty unfriendly, perhaps provocative. It's has been described as an aggressive show of force. And his response was actually, well, no, this is what you deserve. I mean, this is what you do to China.
Yeah. It's like freedom of navigation is something that all navies do.
Yeah.
And Australia's been sending ships with their allies,
Yeah.
the US and the like, into the South China Sea and, through those contested zones now that they have with Taiwan, and doing it for years. And so you kind of hear that and you're like, oh, well, I guess that's kind of fair enough.
From their point of view.
It's understandable.
That's it.
They're just trying to show that they can do the same thing. And
Yeah.
it's just, I guess, geopolitical posturing to some degree.
And it was a good reminder too that, from China's viewpoint, Taiwan is part of China.
Yeah.
And therefore any sort of foreign navies, including Australia's, who are showing up in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea and saying, that's not the case, they see as wrong and aggressive and provocative. All the things that we said about China when their ship showed up in February.
Yeah, exactly. So it is, I guess, a stark reminder of how we sometimes see things through a very particular lens.
I walked away from that interview with the Colonel, Jobo, feeling very much a sense that he was saying China only wants peace, everything will be fine, we're not seeking hostility, unless any of you try and interfere with us
Exactly.
and our ambitions in Taiwan and the region. In which case, yes, there may well be a conflict.
Exactly, and I mean, it raises a scary thought: what will happen if they do invade Taiwan, and what Australia would do with its allies like the US? Because I think that would be a very dangerous time for the world if that were to occur, and it'd be very interesting to see where people would go, because obviously Australia and its allies have been staunch defenders of democracy forever, and they see Taiwan as a like-minded democratic nation.
Yeah.
And so would they just let them be taken over, or would they go in, and what would that mean for the rest of the world? It's scary proposition.
Well, Colonel Jobo had very strong thoughts about, if that conflict were to eventuate, what would happen, didn't he?
He did. We'd lose. And
Australia will lose, he said.
It's hard to argue with
Yeah.
him, he would be on their turf.
Yeah. And not only that, he said, you don't have enough aircraft, he said like a list of why we would lose.
Yeah. Also true, unless you factor in our allies.
Indeed. And I think that was where Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, the Chief of Navy, was a really realistic and measured voice,
Definitely.
Reminding us that we have these incredible allegiances, the naval and military exercises that we do with the Philippines, with Indonesia, with all of these different allies. In a sense, we are preparing for this too. We are preparing for the possibility of a hot conflict.
And he says that that's his job,
Yeah.
to be a pessimist and to look at the worst possible scenario.
Yeah.
But he is very reassuring. Like I walked away from hearing him talk to you and felt pretty good about the position we're in.
It was at times terrifying, but mostly just a fascinating story to work on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not often you get to sit in a room with some of these high-profile figures in our militaries, and so it was very, very interesting.
Yeah. Well, if you missed out on that story, you can watch it on the 60 Minutes YouTube channel or catch up on 9 Now. Thank you, Serge.
Thanks, Amelia.
See you next time.
Cheers.